with my royal shirt on for the All-Star game tonight. So to cheer on Salvador Perez and Jason Vargas and Mike Moustakas. We want to thank you for coming out today. I know it's awfully hot out there, isn't it? So this is probably a good place to be today. So welcome into the nice, cool area. You never have to worry about the Dole Institute being hot, except in its discussion of important topics in contemporary America. Yeah, you like that?
Yeah.
I've been working on that one all afternoon. I wanted to come out. This is the final discussion group of the summer. And I wanted to come out, and I wanted to thank Christina Loon for doing such a great job. She's had a fabulous group of guests. Her guest today, who I'm not going to introduce, she's going to introduce, but he's fabulous too. And it's been really great having her here for this very important series of topics this summer. So please join with me in thanking and welcoming Christina Loon. Christina?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to this fifth and final discussion series. And I want, Bill, thank you so much for selecting me and asking if I would do this. It's been a great series of discussions, and I just appreciate everybody who has come out. What a great gem this is for the university and for the community. It really is. So today's session is, well, they've all been very interesting to me, but it's near and dear to my heart because for a little over 7 years I worked along the U.S.-Mexico border, and there were days when I would cross the border several times. Everybody that has been one of my guests has been someone that I met in the course of that. And when you live and work along the border and have to cross it, it makes you think a lot about these issues in a different way than you're removed from it, which is, as I've told many of you before, that's why I'm here. I wanted to help people who live far away from the border understand how important it really is to all of us, especially here in Kansas. I really want to appreciate and thank Alan Bersin for coming today. I was looking back over notes, and I met Alan in 2009. And Alan had just been tasked, or asked to be a task force co-chair, and I'm going to hold out the document here, the final document. It was co-chair of a group of 30 dignitaries who were brought together by the Pacific Council on International Relations and the COMEXI, the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, to, as I remember it correctly, to reimagine the border. So this was in 2009, and I worked at that time at the San Diego Regional EDC, and the woman who was president had known Alan for years and said, you really have to go talk to Alan. You know, you're the one, you're dealing with the border issues, you need to go talk to him. And so you had been away from the border issues for a little while, and so that's how I met him. And they came up with this report, which we'll get to in a few minutes. I won't bore you with the report, but it was an interesting series of conversations around how the border might work differently here we are in the 21st century. And his role changed very quickly because not long after this group assembled, he was tapped by the Obama administration. And so I'm going to give you just a very brief highlights of your background. So he was tapped very quickly to be, actually you were commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and he served that for how long?
2 years.
And then you were tapped to be the Assistant Secretary of
International Affairs
at Department of Homeland Security. But from my perspective, as the historian in me, Alan's perspective is really shaped as not just by that experience, but by the fact that during the Clinton administration, you had been the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, is that right? And the Attorney General's Southwest Border Representative. So here you had this time gap and this perspective of dealing with border issues over the course of a number of years. And I think that I heard you mention on several occasions how that difference in the time that had elapsed, how that had shaped your thinking. But before we go a little further, I want to, just for everyone, tell a little bit more about yourself besides all of this illustrious titles. Like, where are you from and how did you get into all of this in the first place?
So I actually grew up in New York City, a long way from the border, and was educated in New England, and in the 70s left the East and went out to California in the early 1970s, and spent 40 years pretty much in Southern California, raised a family, 3 daughters, now 2 granddaughters. I grew up with all boys, and I now live with all women for the last 40 years, and I much prefer that, gentlemen. I much prefer that, but was fortunate to be in a couple of respects. Now all of our students think about being transnational and international, but I was able to, at the age of 16, to start traveling in the Merchant Marine, and got a perspective that actually shaped a lot of the way I viewed the world. And then I was also 50 years ago and 50 pounds ago, I was a pretty good football player. 50 pounds heavier. And so I grew up always between the intellects and between the jocks and the nerds, and was therefore in a position to learn from both of them. But I spent the first 18 years of my professional life after law school. I graduated from law school in 1974, and I was a corporate lawyer in Los Angeles for 18 years, and then I've just this past January finished 25 years of nonstop public service in a variety of different sectors. And I should say, before going through those, that my father and mother taught me that if you make 3 big left turns in life, you'll learn something, but you'll also end up where you started. So I'm now, after 25 years in public life, I'm now back in a Washington law firm, not practicing law, but advising on international affairs, and including Mexico and Canada, but other countries in the Arabian Gulf, for example. When I went to San Diego after, in 1992, I was a visiting professor of law at the University of San Diego, and then I was appointed the U.S. Attorney, the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer in Southern California. And after 5 years there as the...
Apologize.
Sorry.
That's all right.
After 5 years there as the so-called border czar, in addition to being the U.S. Attorney, I became part of that group that became non-traditional school superintendents. So I became I spent 7 years as the superintendent of public education in San Diego. And then Arnold Schwarzenegger tapped me as his Secretary of Education in Sacramento. And I came back and thought I was going to live happily ever after as the chairman of the San Diego Airport Authority, and that's when I met Christina and came back into government because Janet Napolitano, who was the Homeland Security Secretary and had been a U.S. Attorney with Janet Reno in the Clinton administration in Arizona, next door to where I was serving, she and I were friendly. And people forget that the first crisis of the Obama administration and the last foreign crisis of the Bush administration was actually the Mexican border, the violence in Mexico and the fear that it would spill over. So she called me and she said, we've got to address this to follow up on what Michael Chertoff had done for President Bush, and I'd like you to come back for a year to help organize this effort because I know you know the border. And famous last words, I spent the 8 years there involved with Homeland Security, which hadn't existed when I was first involved in the border. So what I'd like to do today when we have a discussion is actually talk about, as Christina indicated, how the border is different, how the world has changed from the time that I became, first was introduced to the border in 1992 to when I returned to it in 2009 and where I think it is in 2017.
So kind of moving along then, kind of fast forwarding, as I say, I met Alan when he had been tapped to be a co-chair on this task force to reimagine the border. And though he was not with the task force very long because he had bigger things to do along the border, he nonetheless stayed engaged. In fact, it was because of that he showed up at several of the meetings that took place around this. And I have the full report, which is online, and if you ever want to take a look at it, you can. But so even though you were gone, as I've read through it, I know many of the objectives and goals were embodied in much of the work that you tried to accomplish in the Obama administration about how do we modernize border management, how do we improve our relations so things work better. But as I was kind of looking through the report again, because I hadn't looked at it in a while, one of the conclusions kind of stuck out here. I apologize again for my looking over my glasses here. It said, Mexico and the United States have long squandered opportunities for constructive collaboration along their shared border. The costs have been massive, not simply tens of billions of dollars in economic losses, but a widespread sense that the border is broken or dysfunctional. And then it goes on to say, the last year has offered some auspicious signs, however. And then it goes on to touch on things like better relations around organized crime and beginning to tackle immigration. Can you speak a little bit from your experience about why there was such this perception of a dysfunctional border and the relationship around it and the changes that you've seen?
Sure. So let me start a little bit earlier. Ask you to imagine being back at the time of the founding of our country, or let's move a little bit beyond the Constitutional Convention and the Articles of Confederation, and we have let's go to the time of the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. President Jefferson is in office. If you looked at Mexico and the United States in 1803, before the consummation of the Louisiana Purchase, it would not be clear, I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, which country in 2017 would be the major power, because think about it, we were still 13 colonies becoming 13 states, or maybe 14 or 15 states by 1803. We were pretty much hugged on the East Coast from Maine, from New England to Florida, which didn't belong to the United States. Most of the interior was owned either by France until the Purchase, or in the West Coast was hardly unknown. And Mexico extended from Guatemala, what was then the Spanish Viceroyalty in Guatemala, up through what is today Oregon. It included Texas, and it included California. It included the states of Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and as I said, a good deal of Oregon. And you'd look and you'd say the Spanish Empire had a much more larger military capacity than the fledgling United States. And you might look and you'd say, if I project 200 years ahead, it may well be that Mexico is going to be the main part of this story. And yet, not so. Starting, frankly, with the Louisiana Purchase, and then the securing of the Missouri River and the Mississippi River for commerce and the development of what you folks know so well, which was the heartland of the United States and the agricultural wealth of this country that propelled a different set of results. But as a result of that, we've always had a borderland that was not very much under control. In fact, when Santa Anna came up to destroy the Alamo, and then was defeated by Sam Houston at San Jacinto, part of the difficulty was that the heart of Mexico, down around the highlands where the Aztecs had been and where Cortez conquered them, actually to get up to the northern territories of Mexico and California and Texas was very difficult. You had to go through the Sonoran Desert. You had to go through the Big Bend of Texas. It was not easy. And in fact, the borderlands have always been beyond the control of either Mexico or the United States to control, till very recently, I would submit. And therefore, it was a very peculiar place, and being in Spanish we call borderlanders fronterizos. And for the most part, people living in both countries did not know and did not care, nor did Washington or Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, really concern itself with what was going on in the borderlands. It was not so much a no man's land as an every man and every woman's land. No one was in control. And the relationships between the United States and Mexico, in part because of the asymmetry, because Mexico looked like it was so promising, and then for lots of problems of inequality and political issues there, it did not grow even after independence in 1824, and the United States was on a trajectory toward world power. But the border was a symbol of the relationship between the two. And in fact, the United States, as it was moving from that fledgling set of states toward the world power it became, recognized after World War I, the interesting fact was that we only had two wars with our neighbors, both in the 19th century, one with the British and the Canadians to clarify the northern border, and one with the Mexicans in 1846, which in Mexico is known as the War of North American Invasion. Because in fact, what most Americans never knew and most Mexicans have never forgotten was that as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 after the war, in which Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant played significant roles as junior officers, half of Mexico disappeared. Half of Mexico was severed from that country and became eventually part of the United States. And as I say, to add insult to injury, most Americans never knew it. Most Mexicans have never forgotten it. So in fact, through most of our history, the relationship between Mexico and the United States was proper because it was so asymmetrical. Mexicans could not challenge us militarily, nor would they. But at the borderline, La Linea, that's where one nation became another nation and where we were equal as we were not anyplace else in the bilateral relationship. Because you could say, you cannot cross into my country. And when Pancho Villa raided Colombia, New Mexico, in the context of the Mexican Revolution, General Pershing then pursued Pancho Villa into Mexico. These were the events of the border that happened every 25, every 30 years. But in the meantime, the two countries were friendly, but properly so. And in fact, there was enormous resentment on the part of Mexico toward the United States that led to a series of passive aggressive activities. But the border itself was a place of, now we have 13 or 14 million people who live on the border from San Diego to Brownsville, Texas, and from Tijuana, Baja California, to Matamoros in Tamaulipas in Mexico. But what's happened in the 20 years is that globalization has intervened. And it has changed the nature of border relations in a dramatic way, which I'd like to describe and give you this sense of how it's changed. So for most of our history, our bilateral history, La Linea, that line that was set by the treaty in Texas and separating Tamaulipas, it's the Rio Grande Valley, which in Mexico is known as the Rio Bravo River, not the Rio Grande. And then from New Mexico, Arizona, California, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Baja California, you basically have a land border. But the people who live on that border, the 12 to 14 million people who live on both sides of that border, actually lived in what was considered el tercer país, the third country. The third country. And the third country was marked by a border that was not controlled by either country very well.
Hence the slide that I showed of yours, La Linea sin la ley.
This is the border line in 1993 when I became the United States Attorney and the so-called border czar for Janet Reno. Every night in just that one area of the border, a million people a year were being arrested, but it was a revolving door. They'd be arrested and 2.5 hours later they would try to move across the border again to enter the United States. There were only two basic places on the border that people were crossing illegally. One was in San Diego, Tijuana, and one was in El Paso, Juarez. And in both cases, the migrants were seeking better economic opportunity for the most part, coming up from Mexico, crossing the border and entering in California, and then moving in the western United States, or in Texas, coming across the Rio Grande Valley and coming to seek jobs in the Midwest or in the South, and did a lot of that's really what characterized the border.
Can you explain a little bit, because again, by the time I started working on the border in 2007, things had really changed from your first experience. But I heard many stories about, as the border had tightened up, the law of unintended consequences, that as they tightened up different parts of the border, the unintended consequences was that it made the existing corridors much more valuable real estate to the cartel, and that was one of the main contributing factors to a lot of the violence.
So, in fact, there's a push out of Mexico and a magnet drawing people into the United States. The opportunity to work in the United States, the lack of enforcement of labor laws. We Americans have been a little bit hypocritical that we should probably own up to. We wanted secure borders, but we wanted cheap labor. We wanted people, not so much in Kansas, but I can assure you in California, people wanted housekeepers, they wanted gardeners, They wanted construction workers, and they wanted them as cheaply as they could have them. Drugs. We consume more drugs per capita than any people in the history of the world. And those drugs, actually, for the most part, after Colombia, weakened weakened the routes through the maritime routes from Colombia and Ecuador and Peru through the Caribbean up through Florida, which is where drugs came. When that tightened up in the 1990s, the transit country became Mexico. They started coming up through the land borders across Mexico, and the fact is that it led to the development of a very, very tough series of cartels that constitute Mexican organized crime. And as Christina suggests, which group controlled the entry into the United States had the real estate and would extract fees for crossing through that real estate in ways that became very lucrative. But let me pause here to say, you know, as someone who has worked on the border for 20 years, 25 years now, and has watched the evolution of the border, it strikes me as really peculiar that one of the great bipartisan accomplishments, since the Second World War was actually what I call the restoration of the rule of law to the border. Starting with the Clinton administration, but really intensified by starting with the H.W. Bush negotiation of NAFTA, which I want to come back to, then the passage of NAFTA, but the investment by the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, of nearly $18 billion a year in securing the border, going from a border patrol that was 3,000 when I started, the border looked like that, to a border patrol that's 22,000 today, with all sorts of surveillance mechanisms. You know, remember when Ev Dirksen used to say $1 million here, $1 million there, soon you're talking about real money. All right? $18 billion a year for more than 10 years has actually changed the nature of the U.S.-Mexican border. And yet, we have a zero tolerance. So even when I would say that the number of people crossing the U.S.-Mexican border illegally is the lowest that it's been in 4 decades, ladies and gentlemen. 4 decades. But it's still just under 400,000 people. But I say that's not what it was in 2000 when 1.6 million people were arrested, and now it's 380,000. And we begin to go back to that notion that I started the discussion with, is controlling that territory, sealing it, is not doable. And I think we can talk about the wall and the idea that we could build a Great Wall of China from El Paso to San Diego, and then across the river to Matamoros and Brownsville. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to go back to this idea this border has never been totally controllable at any point because of the nature of the terrain, because of the nature of the socioeconomics that are there, and the idea that we could build a physical wall. I think I understand what the president's state is, why he says that, but I think we have to actually analyze, do we need it? And we should understand why not a single representative from any of the 4 border states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, or California, are supporting it. Not a single representative. you say, well, we should build it anyway. I presided over, when I was the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, presided with David Aguilar, who was my deputy and the head of the Border Patrol. We built 700 miles of barrier on the U.S.-Mexican border to stop trucks from just driving people over, stop drugs from just being driven over. But most of it is with Normandy-type barriers, where you have the wall, and you don't see this anymore in San Diego. That doesn't exist. There's a wall. There's a triple fence in San Diego that actually directs the traffic, so it doesn't permit people to just walk across in the urban areas anymore. Same thing in El Paso, Juarez. But when you get out to the Sonoran Desert, or if you get to some parts of the Rio Grande Valley or the Big Bend, how many have been to the Big Bend National Park? So you know that. You imagine a wall in the middle of that territory? But the fact is that this is a, and listen, I've devoted my professional life to border security. I mean, that's what I've been focused on. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the situation with Mexico has changed dramatically. And part of what's going on now, and I'm really interested in hearing from you. So when we said we were going to scrap NAFTA, you know who's been saying don't scrap NAFTA? It's the farmers in North Dakota, and the farmers in Kansas, and the farmers in the corn farmers of Nebraska, saying you can't scrap that. These are our customers. And what's happened, though, in the last 25 years since George H.W. Bush negotiated with Salinas the NAFTA, is that we've actually grown together in a very remarkable way, in which so much of our food surplus is feeding Mexico, although many of their fruits come back here from, and they give us the winter fruits. But we've developed a integrated production platform. It's a shared production platform. We don't trade so much anymore with Mexico. We build things together. And what is remarkable is that, NAFTA got a bad name back in 1992 when it was Ross Perot running against Clinton and President Bush. And he said, the great sucking sound of American jobs being sucked off to Mexico. Well, the fact of the matter is the only research that's been done academically shows that, in fact, we haven't suffered. The big loss of jobs in the United States did not come from trade with Mexico, but rather from the automation of American factories. And we've got to understand that we are linked with Mexico now in ways that our children and our grandchildren will benefit from. We have, and Canada, I was saying to the students I met with before, think about the future of Mexico, Canada, and the United States. We now have $1 trillion a year in trade with those three, 1.2 trillion to be exact. We have energy independence within reach, which will mean that we won't be dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Figuring out the Syrian problem will be a problem for China, and a problem for Japan, and a problem for Europe. We have huge natural resources in addition to hydrocarbons, from Colombia to the Arctic. And we should be embracing that future. It's the farmers of our Midwest will feed the continent. but we have to see ourselves as part of that future.
I've just put up a slide that shows Mexico's shares and exports by all the states. And those of you who've been here before know I've talked quite a bit. We've talked quite a bit about how important Mexico is to Kansas, for example. Last year it became the primary export market. All of the corn, which I didn't know before this, is sold. All of Kansas corn is sold in Mexico. So I know one of the things that you worked on while you were in the Obama administration was trying to improve the ability. So stepping back, the bigger question is, how do we achieve security but allowing legitimate business to take place? Because that's the reality. I mean, we need to be able to trade with other countries. And so how do we ensure that these trucks can move across the border in an efficient and secure way? And I know that you've been a part of a lot of the innovations that are taking place. Can you address that a little bit?
Sure, Christina. And think about, we tend to think about security and trade facilitation, moving trade, as being mutually exclusive variables. So that, think about products coming across a border. We think, well, if you want to raise the level of security, you have to slow down the crossing so that you could look at every truck, look at every car, check every person. Well, that was actually what we did after 9/11, when we shut down the American borders. It was understandable. We had been attacked. We had been attacked in our homeland in ways that we had never since the British burned Washington in 1812. We had suffered Pearl Harbor in 1941, but this was an attack on the heartland, on the homeland. So what we did was we shut the borders down. And as a result of that, soon President Bush realized that we had wait lines going south into Mexico and north into Canada, 10 to 20 miles of vehicles trying to cross. We measured wait times not by hours, but by half days. And President Bush and many of the rest of the American people realized that we would have given Al-Qaeda the victory that they sought, which was to destroy the modern American society and economy, if we kept doing that. So what's happened over the last 16 years since 9/11 is we've developed, as Christina suggests, a whole variety of ways that looked at the world differently. And one of this was to stop looking at security and trade facilitation as being mutually exclusive. You say, well, okay, this must be some sort of a rhetorical trick. No, it's not. Follow the logic, ladies and gentlemen, with me for a moment. So if you think about the traffic coming across the border, 98% of it is perfectly lawful, right? People crossing. And we're looking for the 2%, which is like looking for a needle in a haystack. And there are only 3 ways. So we started to look at it. So how are we going to find the needle in a haystack? We said, well, there are 3 ways of finding a needle in a haystack. One is, well, there are 4 ways, but you don't want to burn the haystack down. So let's just say there are 3 ways. One is you look at every piece of straw. And that's what we did after 9/11, and it was self-defeating. Would have destroyed the American economy. Can't do that. The second is to actually get very specific intelligence about where the needle is located so you could reach into the haystack and pull it out, and you find it. And in fact, intelligence since 9/11 has gotten much better in the counterterrorist area. So, for example, some of you will remember in October of 2010, I was honored to serve as the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had put PETN explosives into a printer cartridge, put the printer cartridge onto onto a FedEx plane and a UPS plane and sent it with the expectation of blowing up the plane on a timing device over Chicago. And it was actually Saudi Arabian intelligence that tipped off the CIA that this plot was underway. And as a result of that, using that specific intelligence, we're able to reach into the global supply chain of millions of packages and find the two packages where there was a threat to a terrorist threat. And while, as I said, intelligence has gotten better, you can't rely on that every day to produce the result that Christina referenced. So the third way of finding a needle in the haystack is make the haystack smaller. And the way you make the haystack smaller is that you start to qualify the 97 or 98% of the low risk, the lawful trade and travel is low risk, and you identify them and it so that you can actually hurry it through the port of entry so that you can focus your attention on the remaining traffic, which consists either of the cargo or the people about which you have derogatory information or about which you lack sufficient information to make a judgment about whether the cargo or the person presents a risk. That has been the way in which we have expedited lawful trade and travel across the border so that we then focus our inspection resources on the remaining traffic. And at any level of resource allocation, that raises the security level. So how many of you have joined something called the Global Entry Program? Okay. Global Entry Program is a program in which, and all of you, if you've traveled abroad, you come back to the port of entry, whether it's LA or New York or Chicago or Dallas, and you notice that you wait on the line to be inspected by the officer, the Customs and Border Protection officer, and other people just go to a kiosk and swipe their passport, establish biometrically that they are the person who they claim to be in the passport, and they pass through because they have been determined to be low risk, and they get expedited through the port of entry. And they do that by applying and entering into an agreement with the government that we give you information about who I am. You get to vet that information against the watch lists to assure that you're not a terrorist or you're not a cartel member. And the government makes two reciprocal promises. One is that it will keep the information you give it in confidence, and the second is that it will use it only for the purpose of qualifying you as low risk and expediting you as a lawful traveler. But that's been the way, Christina, that we've actually addressed the problems of border trade so that our 46 ports of entry on the U.S.-Mexico border and the 120 smaller ports on the U.S.-Canadian border have actually permitted us to move $1.2 trillion in trade that's expected over the course of the next 10 years to grow to just under $2 trillion. And that, together with this energy independence, together with lawful the trade and travel that we have among the three countries, actually is a terrific asset that will permit us to be able to compete against East Asia, in China, and South Asia, India, and Brazil, and South America, by actually combining and playing our strengths together, and by making the borders secure, but permitting lawful trade and travel to flourish across it.
You mentioned NAFTA a little while ago, and I want to kind of follow up on that. You actually wrote an op-ed piece in June, which I happen to have it right here, in the Dallas Morning News, and you talked about in spite of all the negative rhetoric that's going on about NAFTA, the border, and U.S.-Mexico relations, you said that actually there could be a silver lining to all of this in regards to NAFTA. What did you mean by that?
So I think what we've seen, I'd be happy to explore why I think the president, the campaign started out so anti-Mexican. But as the administration has come into focus and he's heard from the farmers of Nebraska and Kansas, as well as the people in California and Texas, we're now not scrapping NAFTA, but we're going to actually renegotiate it. And that's a good idea. Because, in fact, of the Ross Perot kind of tainting of the NAFTA brand, right congenitally when it was passed by President Bush and then implemented by President Clinton, it got a bad name. So we saw all these benefits grow over the years, but the unions were against it because they thought that it would lose jobs. And the rest of us didn't really defend it, so it got a bad name. But in fact, it's created this huge potential for a North American future, which will be of great utility to our history. But the fact is, over the 25 years, it's a trade deal that needs to be looked at. We need to improve it. We need to look at what many of the things that weren't dealt with now are part and parcel of our economy and our society. So in fact, the original NAFTA deal doesn't say a word about cyberspace, not a word about cyber commerce, not a word about online commerce, not a word about how do we protect intellectual property, how do we actually provide where there is an impact on communities, of factories leaving one country and moving to another, how do we actually support that with retraining capacity? Frankly, the biggest impact on individuals of NAFTA has been the disenfranchisement of the Mexican campesinos. I mean, when we sell all of our wheat and our corn and our soybeans to Mexico, the people that used to raise it, they're the ones who've been thrown off the land. They're the ones that don't have the economic basis anymore, every bit as much as any job that we lost in this country. So in fact, we need to address that too. And this renegotiation that President Trump has created the opportunity for actually could be this silver lining. We end up with a North American 2.0 in which we correct the problems that exist, we update the treaty, but we continue this very robust trade that we have and the shared production platform that exists among Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So in fact, many of the auto parts that are manufactured in Ontario are actually being assembled in Mexican plants together with much of what is assembled in Mexican plants manufactured in the United States. 40 cents of every dollar of a product that comes back into the United States from Mexico was generated in the United States because of this shared production platform. So I think we you know, as I've said to the students, I was honored to meet before, you know, I think President Trump has given us an opportunity to sit back and take a look at a number of things and look at it with a different view, whether it's North Korea or NATO or NAFTA. And I think we can make great gains, particularly in this NAFTA context. The first thing we have to do is get rid of the name. It's a lousy brand. We need to talk about North America 2.0. North America from Colombia to the Arctic, in which we have energy independence, we have trade-friendly borders, we have a continental security in a global age that protects us the way NORAD protected us from Soviet missiles during the Cold War. But in a global world, we need to look at this as a much wider continental arc. Mexico's got the 13th largest economy in the world, 133 million people. The OECD, an analytical think tank in Paris, predicts that in one generation, 2050, 2045, it will have a larger economy than Germany. That's the economic powerhouse, and it's going to be built on the strength of the American economy. 75% of all its exports come to the United States. 48% of its imports come from us. Same thing with Canada. This is a huge, huge economic powerhouse in North America. But we need to develop it. This North America 2.0 that President Trump has ordered renegotiated, I think, is one of the ways to get there.
So the title of this session, for those of you who have your little cards, will see that it's about border trade, and essentially, will a big blank wall really solve America's issues? And earlier this year, at the Brookings Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., held a conference, and there were a number of papers that got a lot of attention, but one that didn't was actually by 3 economists from UCSD, and they looked at immigration patterns. And they talked about the wall, and they said, really, today, given the change in historic immigration patterns, the discussion about building a wall as solving some sort of immigration problem is at least a decade old because immigration patterns have changed. Can you, again, in your experience, talk a little bit about what you saw change in terms of who was coming across the border, who was being stopped?
So the fact of the matter is 4 out of 5 people are being arrested in the Rio Grande Valley, and that lowest number in 30, 40 years are Central Americans, not Mexicans. More Mexicans are leaving the United States voluntarily and involuntarily than are entering, legally or illegally. The large, overwhelming majority of people are coming from Central America, from the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and that's because the same factors that for 70 years pushed Mexicans out of their country, lack of economic opportunity, violence, the desire for family unification, not affecting Mexico today in the same ways. Mexico has got this vibrant economy. There's still huge inequality in Mexico, but 50% of Mexicans are middle class by any measurement. By any measurement, healthcare, fertility. The birth rate in Mexico has dropped from 6.7 per woman in the 1970s to just about a replacement rate of 2.1. Mexico is transitioned, but it's the states, the smaller states of Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, where you have extraordinary violence, no economic opportunity, and people leaving because of natural disasters of droughts and hurricanes, floods that are coming up to the United States. But since President Trump has come in, and given the nature of his rhetoric, it's had a beneficial effect. Illegal immigration has dropped by 80%, even from the Northern Triangle countries. So this idea that it's a Mexico problem is actually not the case. Yes, sir.
What can we do, sir, to get Mexico to stop their accommodation of this free flow? It's almost as if they do not want these economic refugees to linger in their country. They want to be the conduit to make sure that they deliver them to our country.
So, sir, I actually was deeply involved in that as the commissioner and then as the representative. Mexico has arrested 200,000 Central Americans in each of the last 3 years. In fact, we would have been overwhelmed when the unaccompanied minors were coming and then the families were coming. it was Mexico stopping, actually, for the first time, accepting the fact that because their economy has grown, they are now a transit country, and they are a country of destination, actually people coming to work in their factories. So in fact, we are cooperating with Mexico, and you might Google, their operation was called Operation Leonidas, in which they have started to enforce their southern border in sort of the ways that we, since the H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama administrations have been, and now continuing in the Trump administration, really defending it. Our border is really in Guatemala now. That's where the migration is coming from. And the Mexicans are actually doing a great deal to actually stop that flow.
Before we go on, I want to ask you one more question myself, and that is, what has surprised you the most about U.S.-Mexico relations from your experience?
So what we've seen in the 20 years we've gone when we started about this very proper and, the Mexicans being very, very passive-aggressive toward the United States, as a result of this growth in the relationships between the countries economically, and then look, the fact of the matter is we do have 9 million Mexicans here illegally, but that's the result of 70 years of both parties. I mean, this one is a shared responsibility of all of us, and the fact is we have 9 million people here, and we need to actually work to resolve that issue one way or the other. But what's amazing to me is how far we've come in terms of being interdependent, but there's still being a lag in the realization of our people that we're now interdependent. Very curious thing, in Mexico, it's the intellectuals and the opinion leaders that actually are against this closed, building a relationship. It's the people in Mexico accept that. They're starting to play American football, they love baseball, they've certainly voted with their feet to come and improve their lives here. Much of the part of the country I live in has actually been built by Mexican labor. That's been accepted by the Mexican people, and it's their intellectuals that don't like it. Here, it's actually the result is the difference. It's the intellectuals, the opinion leaders who claim this is so great, and the people haven't accepted it yet. But that's going to change as we go through this period, and I think what we've seen with President Trump and the people advising him, and largely hearing from the constituencies, hearing from all those states. 29 of the 50 states depend on Mexico deeply. Our jobs depend on it. 7 million American jobs are directly tied to the relationship with Mexico. And frankly, I can tell you, for someone who didn't know very much about Mexico growing up, look, what they're going through in terms of when I wrote that, was involved in writing the report Christina opened the session with, Mexico was really threatened by organized crime, hugely threatened. And it's not to say the issue's over, but they've made extraordinary strides such that organized crime now is a law enforcement problem, not a national security problem. That's because for the first time with President Bush, they accepted foreign assistance, and I've been part of a group, and the military has been part of a group, NORTHCOM, worked very closely with the Mexicans to actually weaken organized crime. And in some ways, Mexico is going through what we did in our country. So this is a little counterintuitive, perhaps. But part of democratization, which Mexico's going through, actually involves organized crime. So think about what happened in this country in the 20s, 30s, the 40s. Took us 30 years to turn the Cosa Nostra into the Sopranos. It did. Took us 30 to 40 years to do that. From the Kefauver hearings talking about organized crime in this country. I was a kid growing up, and I remember the Appalachian. Remember the raid in Appalachia when the FBI went and arrested all those mafia chieftains in that meeting? People said, we have the mafia in this country? And then we have plenty of corruption left in this country, but we don't have systematic organized crime. That we've actually beaten. It will take Mexico 30 years to beat organized crime or to get it under control. And that was our experience. We shouldn't expect a different result in Mexico. But the fact is they've made huge problems. The big challenge before Mexico is they've got to deal with systematic corruption. Now, if you go back, there's a great book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote the book about Lincoln, the Civil War, The Team of Rivals. She wrote another book that I really commend to you, and I give it to all my Mexican friends. It's called The Bully Pulpit. It tells the story of Teddy Roosevelt and William Taft and how corrupt this country was at the turn of the century. I mean, the railroads, I don't have to tell people in Kansas this. Railroads own the legislatures, everything. They own the police departments and the sheriff's offices. And we had plenty of corruption in this country, systematic corruption. And it tells, what this bully pulpit does is it tells the story about how, starting with Teddy Roosevelt and the muckrakers and democratic elections and crusading good prosecutors, that we ended up getting a hold of systematic corruption. We still have corruption, but it's not systematic. It doesn't, you know, in order to get somewhere in this society, it's not totally corrupted the way it was. And Mexico remains that way. But Mexico's at that point in its history where it has to take on this. And I have to tell you, there are a group of young entrepreneurs, young business men and women in that country that are going to do that. But they've got to put a couple of sitting governors in jail. And they haven't yet, the political system hasn't yet gotten to the point where it'll do that. But Mexico will deal with organized crime and will deal with corruption, but it's going to take 30 or 40 years. I mean, that's just the nature of those beasts. But the trajectory, I think, is good, and we're a good model for them. You know, when I first got involved in this, Mexicans wouldn't want to admit that they could learn anything from the United States. And they are, by and large, terrific partners on the border. So the border, which was this uncontrollable area where we had conflict, has now actually been the crucible in which we've built a relationship that's not perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not perfect and never will be. But we have a chance to build a North America with the Canadians and with the Mexicans that will actually ultimately solve the problems of Central America. We just have to see that the same process of moving the low-cost manufacturing to those countries and the same economic processes continue, and you'll see that happen. And then we need to develop with the Canadians the Arctic. The Arctic is a huge area of great economic potential for us. So I'm as I get older, I get more optimistic. But I think there's some factual basis for it. I'm not as, I understand that perfection is not the standard. But I'm satisfied that on the border and in immigration, trade, we have more work to be done, but we've been moving in the right direction and have been for 25 years under both parties. Problem is that neither party wants to acknowledge it.
So let's open it up to more questions.
I appreciate, is this on? I appreciate your message about how we've been contradictory in our messaging to Latin America regarding drugs, stop the drugs, and yet we consume them. We're huge consumers of drugs. Stop illegal immigration, and yet we want that cheap labor. We at least have a criminal policy about illegal drugs to try to suppress their use. We don't really have a criminal policy for employers who will hire undocumented, people. Do you see something like that ever getting through Congress, holding the actual employers accountable for hiring?
So biometrics permit us to do this. What we've got to do is get the political will, and what I fear is that we haven't addressed this in the 25 years that I've advocated for it, along with other people, which is if you want to eliminate illegal migration, eliminate the job magnet. And you do that by enforcing the requirements. And then you have systems of bringing in workers to address particular deficit areas. We in the United States have chosen not to do that. I believe, and the tragedy is that immigration reform only comes around once a generation. I came back into the government. The truth, Christina didn't say it. I came back into the government because having been involved in all of these enforcement activities, I actually thought we had reached the point where we could put in a system of employer sanctions, that we had sufficient border authority. I mean, look at what President Trump, simply with rhetoric, he's actually stopped a lot of the illegal migration. But that's because we have 22,000 Border Patrol agents there as well. And we have systems of surveillance. But I thought we could actually do this. And then the way we would deal with the 9 million people who live in the shadows of the country was we would require that they establish that they're law-abiding, that they pay their back taxes, that they make good on the debts that they owe, that the criminals would be deported, and that we would give them a path to citizenship that they would have to earn. And we came close to that, frankly. Came close to that with the bipartisan bill in 2012, 2013, where senators from both parties had put together a bill, and the House would not implement it. And I fear we missed a big opportunity. We missed a big opportunity because it was a bill that was acceptable to a wide range of people, all but the far left and the far right could have lived with this bill. And that's the way America's worked in the past. But we are living in a period of particular polarization, which I hope we will transcend. But I don't know that we're going to get it back, because so much of the campaign was based a lot on frustration. And it pointed to the immigrant issue and the lack of the border working as being the primary problem. I have great hope that this president actually could reverse that and say, we've stopped the migration, and we will build this wall if it resumes, but then go on to actually create an immigration reform package. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I do know, in the same way that President Nixon took us to China, President Trump could take us to comprehensive immigration reform.
I was in the changes you were describing there. It would seem that type of work that Border Patrol has to do on the ground is, in some ways, very different than what was required in the past. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how the organizational culture has changed and what challenges lie ahead in that regard.
That's it's a good point, because most of the people who are crossing the Rio Grande Valley illegally now are not trying to avoid immigrant Border Patrol agents, trying to find them. The reason they're doing that is that they claim, if you claim asylum under our existing laws, You're actually paroled into the country while your asylum claim, after you've met the credible fear standard, which is very low. And because we don't have sufficient number of immigration judges, we've never built up the immigration court, people are paroled into the country waiting for their hearing. So the Border Patrol actually is, it's important, but it's not there to be stopping lots of people trying to find out where they're crossing illegally. We do a lot of work between the ports of entry where the Border Patrol works on stopping drugs. So the Border Patrol continues to do that in an important way. But in the migration area, you're precisely right. It's a different role. Where people try to cross illegally, the Border Patrol will be there, and for the most part, it's stopping them. It's not seamless, but when I started in this business, 1 million people a year were entering the country illegally. It's far less than 1/10 of that today. So the Border Patrol is actually in an interesting institutional period, culturally and organizationally. But the Border Patrol was formed in 1924. And you know what its first job was? To stop booze coming in over the northern border during Prohibition. That was the first job of the Border Patrol. And if you follow the history of the Border Patrol, its mission has changed. And I believe that you will see Border Patrol agents clearing people into the United States within a generation, but doing so from Europe. That actually continental security means that we secure the flow of goods and people coming toward us, and you do it as far away from the borderline as you can, and as early in time as you can before they arrive here. So that we will not, much more important in a global world than the la linea, are actually the flows. And the Border Patrol is adapting to that right now. But I will tell you that there is a cultural change. There is a cultural change that's going on because, in fact, the Border Patrol agents, and these are terrific young men and women, back in 2014, during the unaccompanied minor surge, they were actually changing diapers, right? You had lots of young children, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds coming up by themselves, and mothers coming with young children, with babies, infants, and the Border Patrol dealt with that. It wasn't part of their job description. But I have great confidence in these men and women that they will actually adjust. Many of them now are serving in southern Mexico. That was that gentleman's question before. That we have Border Patrol agents working with Mexican immigration in southern Mexico on the Guatemalan border. Because of the sensitivity in Mexican politics still, that's not been publicized a great deal, but it's happening. And you will see more and more the placement of our law enforcement officials away from the border because the flows are more important than the line. And you want to actually secure those flows away from the line. The border's line is no longer the first line of defense, it's the last line of defense. And that's part of the cultural change that's going on.
Since we've been talking about the border quite a bit and the crossing and stuff, have you, since you work for the, border security and so on, have you ever thought about using random single carrier stop? So instead of doing random, just random selecting, you select a specific carrier for that day that you can stop continuously all day.
Well, how would that be random, though?
Well, it's kind of like a drug testing, right? When you select a person, it's just a person, but instead you select a carrier. So that way, that carrier and that particular day, we have to stop at least 10 or 15 trucks.
Yeah. So the men and women of the Border Patrol does between the ports of entry, and the ports of entry are handled by people in the same Customs and Border Protection, but they call CBP officers, Customs and Border Protection officers. They actually have a lot of strategies of detection that way, which is they will have random, but mostly what you want to do in this is make the haystack smaller. So you want to know your customer and let them through, but every once in a while, randomly check someone. So there's a program like Global Entry. There's a program on the Mexican border called Sentry that permits you to pass in an expedited way because you are a trusted traveler. On the Canadian border, it's called the Nexus program. But even in those programs, you do random stops. So you will stop someone just to check. Yeah.
The reason I say that is because the majority of what we're trying to protect in the U.S., it is not coming from that needle. It's coming through the legitimate traffic.
Right.
So therefore, if we implement something that I'm deeply involved with the U.S. relations and so on and so forth, and if you focus your attention on those particular, and they know, I guarantee that the flow will
Well, but it's not, the strategy can't just be random, because you certainly don't want to do one carrier, on this day, because if that leaks out, every other carrier will be infected. So there's a sophisticated series of checks, but a lot of it is done by technology now, screening. A lot of it's done by big data analysis. Who's the importer? Who's the exporter? What's the carrier? What's their track record? I mean, we've been collecting this data of every person and every cargo crossing the U.S. border for 25 years now. So there's a lot of data. The question is, how do you search that data to develop usable information that you can use for the law enforcement purposes you're seeking? Thank you.
Can we talk a little bit about economic growth? Right now, the U.S. experiencing economic growth. We basically under unemployment rate right now, we dropped for 4.8% right now, and it's still dropping. So of course we have an issue, with Kansas, a lot of Kansas companies that have issues with labor. So I think we do need, I agree, we do need a immigration reform, because we definitely need the labor, especially on the field, on the farms, and many companies are looking for labor. And the other issue I was going to ask you is, there's priorities on the line. Will it be stopping, immigration, or drugs, or other sources, or terrorism? And what's your opinion about that? What will be the priority today?
Yeah. So let me take the second one first. The job of Homeland Security, which when I was a prosecutor, I was in the Department of Justice. When I came back, I came into the Homeland Security Department, and I'm convinced that was the right move by President Bush and the nation at that time, is to create a unified border authority. So we used to, when I was the so-called border czar in the 1990s, at every one of the port of entry, we had 3 port directors. We had an immigration director from the Department of Justice. We had a customs director from Department of Treasury, and we had an agricultural inspection officer from the Department of Agriculture. Every port had 3 separate directors. Not the most efficient way to operate. So I'm convinced that this is the right way to do it. We also introduced the notion of counterterrorism into the Homeland Security business. But the fact is that Border Patrol agents, CBP officers have a big role in keeping all dangerous things and dangerous people away from the homeland, to prevent them from doing harm to the homeland, and to help us, the American people, rebound and recover when harm is done. But the fact is that DHS, the counterterrorist mission, although it's an important mission, keeping dangerous people and dangerous things away, is actually more a responsibility of the intelligence community, the Department of Justice, the NSA, but it's a whole of government enterprise. So I look at this and I say, the priorities for Homeland Security are basically border security, which has a counterterrorist dimension, but it has an anti-narcotic dimension, an anti-illegal immigration, an anti-intellect, pirating counterfeit goods coming across. So that's the job of the border agencies, and the priorities are that, and administering the immigration laws, and then helping us rebound and recover and have resilience after harm is done. That's what I see as the DHS mission going forward. And I think it's going to take a while to continue to develop. It's a young bureaucracy, but DHS is now the third largest department in the federal government. 255,000 employees, $60 billion budget. Only the Defense Department and the Veterans Affairs are larger. But I think by and large, DHS is not seamless. It's got a lot of development to do, but basically the right decision. So the first question on immigration, and I think it's going to have to come from people of Kansas and the Midwest, who are going to say, look, we're not against immigrants. In fact, we are all the children and grandchildren of immigrants. What we want, though, is a system that is sensible and a system that produces a reliable work that can be fairly paid, not under the table, but fairly paid. And we need that kind of a reform. There's no question about that. But I will tell you that it's got to come from folks like you, because it's not going to be heard from people in the East Coast or the West Coast. It's got to come from the Midwest, and people have got to say, we want immigration. We are the children of immigrants and the grandchildren of immigrants. And we recognize that if the selection processes are right, and people are permitted to come in and held accountable for their responsibility, and we're held accountable so that, in fact, there's employer sanctions. If you try to hire someone under the table, you will be prosecuted. That's the kind of system we need. There's no question about it. Look, one of the great of all the benefits of this North America that I projected are the demographic dividends. When you look at the growth that's happened in South Korea and Singapore and Vietnam, it's what they've all benefited from, and Taiwan. They've benefited from what they call the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is when your birth rate drops, and you go through that period where you have more people in the workforce. That's where we are now in the United States because of immigration, but more so because of Mexico. Mexico's right in that sweet spot now. And the next 30 to 40 years can be a great period of economic growth, but we need this labor. We need the young people to pick the crops and provide the industrial force that we don't have without it. But we need the folks in Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and North Dakota, Ohio, Illinois. We need you folks to say, look, we're not against immigration. Our country was built on immigration, but we want it done properly. And that's something I think would be responsive to the needs of Kansans today, where, frankly, as you know, you have a population drain. You have more people, fewer people coming into the state than leaving the state, and we've got to address that.
I want to ask a question to the crowd. How many of you know the average age of a Mexican? The average age of a Mexican. What is the average age of a Mexican?
Yes, sir.
My understanding is the Trump administration has been historically slow on nominating positions to presidential appointment positions. And I'd like to hear your take on that, and also your take on the interaction between presidential employer appointment positions and senior civil service.
Yeah, so I thought I was part of the slowest administration in terms of hiring, both in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, but this has been very slow. And I know from my colleagues who are still in the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, that it's a great concern. Because in fact, you have senior civil servants who are underappreciated, but they can't be expected to make big policy decisions or implement them. So you basically have a continuation of the status quo, although excellent cabinet people like Mike Mattis, Defense Secretary, or John Kelly at Homeland Security, or Rex Tillerson at State, they can give directions, but it's difficult to carry them out without having, as you say, the appointees in place who can be responsive and can be accountable politically for seeing that these policies are carried out. I hope this will be addressed. I think people are working very hard on it in and around the White House. But you know, the problem is definitely there, and it definitely is complicating following up on many of the opportunities that we have. I think right now to review policies and change them. Part of it, though, I think has got to be acknowledged by the Trump White House, is they're finding it hard to recruit people. They're finding it hard to recruit people because of the slowness of getting in there, and something that I experienced. This is a bipartisan problem. Why should anyone want to become part of, you know, and I asked this of myself, whether I would have gone through another 25 years of public service. I have to disclose everything that I do. I have a very few things that left that people don't know about publicly. I have to actually go through a whole series of screenings, and frankly, what it's done is it's driven people away from wanting to serve in the public offices. People say, why should I put myself through that? We actually have to address that. We can't make becoming a public official require that you're a saint, because you know what? We just don't have that many saints around. And that's part of the problem. So you put your finger on a big issue. Part of it's sui generis to problems of this administration, but the general problems are actually more responsible.
Reducing the number of presidential appointees and increasing the number of senior civil service positions?
You know, we have, ever since Andrew Jackson, we've had the so-called spoils system. And frankly, it served us in a way that I don't know that we could have put a system like the British Whitehall system in, you know, even there they have political appointees, but not as many, I grant you that. I don't think the problem that we've had is because we have a lot of political appointees. You know, in the whole of government, which is about 1 million people in the federal government, I think you're dealing with fewer than 5,000 political appointees. So it's not, in the statistical scheme of things, it's not that large a proportion.
The other part of my question was, what was your experience as an appointee? That's okay. As an appointee working with senior civil service?
Excellent, excellent. I will tell you that part of there are plenty of lazy people in the federal service, but the vast majority of these senior civil servants are actually very dedicated. We're lucky to have them. We're lucky to have them. I always found it an honor to work with them. I found it an honor to work with them, and the ones that were not productive, I found a way not to work with them.
We have time for one more question.
I'm really interested in finding reliable, sensible, pragmatic sources of information on all these different dimensions that you've covered everything. You know, I won't repeat the list, but you've covered a lot of terrain. So my first question is, do you have your own webpage or blog? And secondly, who else or what other organizations or individual opinion people, whatever you want to call them, can you recommend?
Yeah. So I actually will get to the Institute a list of publications that I've written over the years, including a couple on public education, and I will get you those. And you know, we talked earlier. I think when we saw the multiplication of sources that are now available on the internet and are available on the various media, I thought initially that this would be terrific for public debate. And I must say that sadly, even though the sources of information have multiplied so dramatically, we've gotten into a bad habit of only looking at those sources that we're comfortable with, that we agree with. We only turn to those channels on the cable that we know what we're going to hear, and we know what we don't listen to anymore. And it's one of the really enervating features of our contemporary political life. So I guess I would say there is more information available than ever before at our fingertips. It requires that you read with a discriminating eye and you filter with a sharp sense of skepticism, which is native to our peoples. But there's plenty of information out there. Plenty of information about borders, trade, immigration, it's an asset that we need to capitalize on, but we need to start training our younger people to be open to multiple sources and to be skeptical, and I must tell you that if I look at people that Bill Lacey's brought to this institute and that Christina Loon have brought to meet with folks like you and the students that I had the privilege of meeting before, I remain an optimist about this. We're in a huge transition in this world and in this country. And times of change produce anxieties and they produce fears. But you know, those of my vintage know that the good old days weren't so good. They just weren't. There were plenty of problems. And Americans have been known for solving problems. That's what we're good at. We should acknowledge them and get back to work and solve them. So I'm a realist, but I'm also an optimist about this country. I'm a patriot who believes that our greatest days do, like President Reagan said, they're in front of us. But that requires that we recognize that the past wasn't so great, and that we are in this huge transition, and that we support those people of my vintage have to support and mentor the next generation. And I will tell you, having spent 10 years in public education, you know, for those of us who think, oh, the young people, their country's going to hell in a handbasket, they don't know what they're doing. It's not true, ladies and gentlemen. It's just not true. If you talk to the young people, not only the young people at the Dole Institute, talk to the young people in school and give them a hand up. Take the time to talk to them. You'll find that they're better looking than we were, they're stronger than we were, they're smarter than we were, and if we can get through a difficult time politically, which is part of a transition, and the huge transitions that are going on, we're going to be stronger. The only thing I ask you to might take away from that map and from this talk and our dialogue is the American century, after an unbelievable period after World War II, it may be coming to a close, but it's coming to a close in the context of a North American century that's just beginning. And if we seize that, it'll be the time of continued great American leadership for the benefit of the world. But we have to do it. We have to do it in concert with our Canadian neighbors and our Mexican neighbors. And actually, they're not our neighbors because you can't move away from them. They're our partners. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Alan, very much for making the trip. Thank you all for coming today, and for those of you who have attended some or all of the sessions, I hope it was a nice way to spend an afternoon and learn a lot more about our neighbor. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.